The most expensive mistake you can make at a Costco meat case is not buying the wrong grade. It is buying the wrong steak within the grade you already paid for. You can have two ribeyes sitting side by side, carrying the same USDA grade and almost the same price per pound, and one can give you a thick, juicy bite while the other leaves you fighting through chewy meat. The difference is often visible before you ever put the package in your cart. Most shoppers never look that closely. They see prime, they see a good price, they grab the first package that looks red enough and keep moving. That is understandable. Nobody ever taught most people how to read a steak, but once you know what to look for, the meat case changes. You stop shopping by the label alone and start shopping by the actual piece of meat in front of you, and you can make that decision in less than a minute. I have always believed that a good butcher should be able to explain what he sees without making it sound like some kind of secret science. There is nothing magical about selecting beef. You are simply learning to recognize the things that affect how that steak is going to eat. So forget the biggest package, the brightest red color, and the fanciest word on the label for a moment. Turn the tray over, look at the meat itself. That is where the useful information is. The first thing I want you to understand is that a steak is not automatically good just because it carries a high grade. The grade gives you information about the beef as a whole, especially its marbling and overall quality, but it does not tell you everything about the individual steak sitting in your hand. That matters. Imagine a long ribeye roast being cut into individual steaks. Every slice comes from a slightly different position along that roast. The shape changes. The amount of the outer muscle changes. The thickness can change. The fat distribution can change. So even when two packages have the same grade and the same price per pound, they are not necessarily equal. This is where your eyes become more useful than the sticker. Start with a ribeye. Look toward the outside edge of the steak. You will usually see a larger central muscle and a curved section of meat around it. That outer section is commonly called the ribeye cap or spinalis. And if you have ever eaten an exceptional ribeye and wondered why one part seemed dramatically more tender and flavorful than another, there is a good chance that outer section was part of the reason. The cap is prized because it tends to carry generous marbling and a different texture from the central eye. But here is what matters when you are standing at the meat case. The cap does not have to be the same size on every steak. One package may have a broad, substantial crescent around the outside. Another may have only a narrow strip. Same grade, same general cut, possibly the same price, different eating experience. So don't just glance at the package and move on. Look at the shape. If you are comparing several ribeyes, look for the steak with a substantial cap and good marbling running through the meat. You are not looking for one giant blob of fat. You want fine distributed flecks throughout the muscle. That distinction is important. Marbling is intramuscular fat. When the steak cooks, that fat contributes to juiciness, flavor, and the overall eating quality of the meat. But more visible fat does not mean every bite will automatically be better. You still need balance. A steak covered in exterior fat but lacking useful marbling inside is not the same thing as a well-marbled steak. So look between the muscle fibers, not just around the outside. This is one of those things that takes about 10 seconds to understand once someone points it out, and once you see it, you cannot really unsee it. The second thing I look at is thickness. This sounds almost too simple, but it makes an enormous difference when you cook steak at home. A very thin steak gives you very little room to work. You want enough thickness that you can develop a browned crust on the outside while keeping the center at the doneness you actually want. With a thin steak, those two goals start fighting each other. You put the meat into a hot pan and try to build a proper crust. By the time the exterior has developed the color and texture you want, the center may already be much more cooked than you intended. A thicker steak gives you a bigger window. That is why, when I compare packages, I want a steak that is reasonably thick and, just as importantly, evenly thick. Look at the side of the package. Don't just look straight down at the meat. If one end is substantially thinner than the other, you are going to have a harder time cooking the entire steak evenly. One part can be ready while another part still needs heat. A thick, relatively uniform steak is easier to season, easier to sear, easier to monitor, and more forgiving when you are cooking at home. That is an important word with beef: forgiving. A well-marbled, properly thick steak gives you some room for error. A thin, poorly marbled steak does not. The third thing I want you to inspect is the shape of the muscle itself. This is especially useful when you are buying New York strips. A proper strip steak is primarily one main muscle, but depending on where a steak was cut from the strip loin, you can sometimes see another section of meat separated by a seam. There is nothing inherently wrong with that extra muscle. The problem is paying premium strip steak money for a piece that includes a substantial amount of a different, less desirable section. This is why I always tell people to stop looking only at the price tag. Look at the boundaries between the muscles. A natural seam is telling you something. It tells you that the steak is not necessarily composed of one uniform muscle from edge to edge. If you are comparing several strips, choose the one with the cleanest, most desirable shape rather than automatically grabbing the first package on the stack. That little inspection can be worth more than staring at the label for another 30 seconds. And there is another place where this kind of inspection matters even more: filet. People see tenderloin and assume there is nothing to worry about because tenderloin is already known for tenderness. But even a very tender muscle can have something on it that you don't want to chew. Look for silverskin. It has a shiny, almost pearly appearance and feels very different from normal fat. That distinction matters because fat can soften and render during cooking. Silverskin does not behave that way. It can tighten when heated and leave you with a tough, unpleasant piece of connective tissue. If you buy a tenderloin or filet that still has some silverskin attached, that does not necessarily mean you should throw it back. It means you should understand what you are buying. A sharp knife and a few careful minutes can remove it. The important thing is knowing that you are looking at connective tissue rather than assuming every white section on the steak is harmless fat. That is a butcher's habit. We don't just ask, does this look good? We ask, what exactly am I looking at? The same thinking applies to T-bones and porterhouses. Both contain strip steak and tenderloin separated by the bone. The major difference is the size of the tenderloin section. So if two packages are priced similarly, compare that filet portion. You are not just buying a steak, you are buying the combination of muscles attached to that bone. And sometimes the better value is sitting right there in plain sight. Now let's talk about something that can save you even more money. Don't limit yourself to individual steaks. Look at the larger pieces of beef. Depending on what your Costco location carries, you may find whole or larger subprimal cuts such as strip loins, ribeye roasts, or whole tenderloins. This is where the average shopper and the butcher start thinking differently. The average shopper sees a 12-pound piece of meat and thinks, that's too much. The butcher sees 12 pounds of steaks that haven't been cut yet. There is a difference. A whole strip loin can be portioned at home with a sharp knife. You decide the thickness. You decide how much exterior fat to remove. You decide which steaks are going into the freezer and which ones are going on the grill this weekend. You also get to see the entire piece before you divide it. That gives you information you don't get when the meat has already been sliced into individual packages. Now, I'm not going to tell you that everyone should buy whole cuts. If you cook steak twice a year, don't have freezer space, or simply don't want to spend time trimming and cutting beef, buy individual steaks. There is nothing wrong with paying for convenience, but if your household eats steak regularly, this is worth considering. The actual savings will depend on the cut, the location, and the current price. So don't assume every whole piece is automatically cheaper. Check the price per pound, then compare it with the price of the same cut already portioned. Sometimes the difference is meaningful, and when it is, you are essentially paying yourself for doing a little of the work that someone else would otherwise have to do. There is another detail I want you to pay attention to, especially when shopping at a warehouse store. Read the small print on the package. Some beef can be mechanically or blade tenderized. That means blades have been used to penetrate the meat. There is nothing inherently wrong with the process, but it changes how you should think about food safety because bacteria that were originally on the surface can potentially be carried farther into the meat. If the package says the steak has been mechanically or blade tenderized, follow the cooking instructions and food safety guidance associated with that product. Don't ignore the label simply because the steak looks beautiful. This is one of those cases where the butcher's eye and the food safety label work together. One tells you what you are buying, the other tells you how you should handle it. And while we're talking about labels, don't let a fancy word make the decision for you. You may see terms such as Wagyu, Prime, Choice, or other marketing language. Those words can be useful, but they should never replace looking at the actual meat. Marbling is visible, thickness is visible, muscle shape is visible, trim is visible. The label cannot tell you which individual steak has the best shape inside the package. Your eyes can. That is the bigger lesson here. A high grade does not turn your eyes off. It gives you a starting point. Then you inspect the steak. Now, there is one mistake I see people make after they finally learn all of this. They become so focused on buying the perfect steak that they forget what happens after they get home. You can choose the best ribeye in the case and still ruin it. A cold pan, poor surface drying, overcrowding, weak heat, or simply cooking by guesswork can turn an excellent piece of beef into a disappointing dinner. The selection is only half the job, but it is the half that most people were never taught. Think about how people normally shop for steak. They look at price, then grade, then maybe the sell-by date, then color. What they often don't examine is the actual construction of the steak. That's the part I want you to change. Next time you are standing in front of that refrigerated case, don't rush. Take a few packages out, compare them. For ribeye, inspect the cap and the marbling. For strip steak, look at the muscle shape and seams. For filet, check for silverskin and examine the overall thickness. For T-bones and porterhouses, compare the tenderloin portion. For larger cuts, calculate the price per pound before assuming you are getting a bargain. And always read the small print. You don't need a special membership to butcher school. You don't need a secret supplier. You don't need to spend twice as much. You simply need to slow down long enough to see what you are actually buying. I remember an old habit from working around meat counters. When you are unsure between two pieces, don't stare at the label. Study the meat. The label tells you what the seller wants you to know. The cut tells you what you are actually getting. That distinction has saved people plenty of disappointing dinners, and it is especially useful when two packages cost nearly the same, because the goal isn't to find the most expensive steak. It is to find the best piece of beef for the money you are willing to spend. That's a very different way of shopping. So the next time you go to Costco, give yourself an extra 5 minutes. Don't put the first package in your cart. Compare several, look at the thickness, study the marbling, find the ribeye with the better cap, inspect the strip for unwanted muscle sections, turn the filet over and look for silver skin, check the tenderloin portion on T-bones and porterhouses, then read the label carefully, especially for any mechanical tenderizing information. You may discover something surprising. The best steak in the case may not be the one with the biggest sticker, the brightest color, or the fanciest marketing. It may be sitting right beside it, and the price may be exactly the same. That is why I tell people that good steak shopping isn't really about spending more money. It's about wasting less of the money you already spend. So tell me about your own experience. What's the cut that has disappointed you the most? A ribeye that looked beautiful but ate tough? A strip that never seemed worth the price? A filet that wasn't nearly as tender as you expected? And next time you're at the meat case, look at the steaks differently. Don't ask only which one is the most expensive. Ask which one would I choose if I had to eat it myself. That's the question a good butcher has been asking for years. And once you learn to see the answer, you don't need anyone standing behind the counter to point it out for you. The next step is even more interesting, taking one of those larger whole cuts home and breaking it down yourself. Because once you understand where the steaks come from, you can start deciding exactly how thick every steak should be, what needs trimming, and which pieces belong in the freezer. That's where buying beef stops being confusing and starts becoming a skill. There is another part of buying whole cuts that deserves more attention than it usually gets, and that is how you divide the meat once you bring it home. Because cutting a steak is not just about making a slice, it is about deciding what that slice is going to do in the pan. If you like a thick steak, cut it thick. If you prefer smaller portions, cut them smaller. If you are feeding several people, you can portion the whole piece according to the meal instead of accepting whatever thickness the store happened to put in the tray. That flexibility is one of the quiet advantages of buying larger cuts. And there is something else. When you cut your own steaks, you begin to understand the structure of the meat. You see where the muscles change. You see the direction of the grain. You see where the fat is sitting. You start recognizing why one section behaves differently from another. That knowledge makes you a better cook because you are no longer treating every piece of beef as if it were identical. Take the grain, for example. Those long lines running through a piece of beef are the direction of the muscle fibers. When you slice cooked steak, cutting across those fibers shortens them. That generally makes the bite easier to chew. It sounds simple because it is simple, but it is one of those details that gets overlooked because people spend so much time worrying about seasoning. Salt matters, heat matters, the cut matters, but so does the direction in which you eventually slice the cooked meat. And this brings us to something I want to make very clear. There is no buying trick that can turn every cheap cut into a ribeye. Sometimes the meat itself sets the limit. A heavily worked muscle contains more connective tissue. Some cuts need slow cooking. Some are better thinly sliced. Some respond beautifully to braising but become disappointing when treated like a steak. That is why understanding the cut is more valuable than memorizing one miracle technique. If you buy a chuck roast and expect it to behave like a strip steak, the problem isn't necessarily the beef. The problem is that you asked the wrong muscle to do the wrong job. A butcher learns to respect that difference, and you can learn it too. The same principle applies when someone tells you that one marinade will make any steak tender. Be careful with claims like that. A marinade can add flavor. Certain ingredients can affect the outer portion of the meat. Salt can influence how meat retains moisture and seasons throughout the surface. But none of that magically changes every tough muscle into tenderloin from the center all the way through. There are limits, and knowing those limits is part of knowing beef. That is why I would rather show you how to choose properly in the first place. Start with a cut that already has the characteristics you want, then use cooking to bring those characteristics out. Don't buy a poor piece of meat and spend the entire afternoon trying to rescue it. Now let's talk about another thing that can fool your eyes: color. People have been trained to think that the brightest red package must be the freshest or best steak. It isn't that simple. The appearance of fresh beef can change depending on how the meat has been exposed to oxygen and how it has been packaged. So color by itself is a weak buying test. Look at the whole picture. Does the meat have good marbling? Is the steak thick and reasonably even? Does the muscle shape make sense for the cut? Is there excessive connective tissue? Is the package intact? Does the label give you any important handling information? Those questions tell you much more than simply asking which package looks the reddest. And don't confuse exterior fat with marbling. This is another common mistake. A thick white border around the steak can be trimmed away. Marbling is distributed inside the muscle. When you're trying to predict eating quality, the internal fat is the part you want to study. But even then, don't go hunting for the steak with the largest possible amount of fat. You're looking for useful marbling, not a block of fat pretending to be a steak. There is a balance. Now, if you are cooking a thick steak at home, there is one habit I would strongly recommend. Use a thermometer. I know that sounds almost too basic, but guessing by time alone is one of the easiest ways to overcook an expensive piece of beef. The steak doesn't know what time it is. It doesn't care whether the recipe says 6 minutes. Thickness, starting temperature, pan temperature, and the cooking method all affect the result. The thermometer gives you information instead of a guess, and that is exactly how you should approach steak. Information first, then action. You can build a beautiful crust and still end up with the center more done than you wanted if you aren't paying attention. So don't become attached to a particular number of minutes. Pay attention to the meat. Use the thermometer. And remember that the steak will continue changing after it leaves the heat. That's another reason thicker steaks are easier to manage. They give you more room between raw and overcooked. A very thin steak can cross that line before you have time to react. A thick one gives you a little more control. That is what I mean when I call a good steak forgiving. It doesn't mean you can abuse it. It means the meat gives you a better margin for error. Now let's go back to the warehouse case for a moment. One of the biggest advantages of buying there is selection. But selection only helps if you actually compare what is available. If there are 20 packages of the same cut, don't assume they are 20 identical steaks. They may share a grade, they may share a price, they may even come from the same larger piece of beef, but their individual shapes and proportions can still vary. This is where taking an extra minute becomes worthwhile. Move the packages around, look at the edges, compare thickness, look through the plastic from different angles. Find the one that looks structurally best. You don't need to touch the meat through the package. You don't need to squeeze it. You don't need to perform some complicated inspection. Just learn to look. And that habit can become automatic. The first few times you may spend a minute or two. After you've done it repeatedly, you'll start recognizing the differences almost immediately. That's how butcher knowledge works. It isn't magic, it's repetition. You see hundreds of pieces of meat, and eventually your eyes start noticing things before your brain has even put the thought into words. But you don't need decades behind a counter to get the benefit. You only need to start paying attention. And there is another advantage to doing this. You become much harder to impress with marketing. A fancy label doesn't bother you. A huge sticker doesn't bother you. A photograph of a beautiful steak doesn't bother you. You look at the actual piece in front of you. That is the only one you're eating, and that's the one that matters. Now, if you are trying to stretch a grocery budget, I would take this even further. Don't automatically buy the same steak every time. Learn 2 or 3 cuts well. Learn what a good ribeye looks like. Learn what a good strip looks like. Then learn one less expensive cut that fits the way you normally cook. That gives you options. You might have a ribeye night when you want the full steakhouse experience. Another week, you might buy a larger strip loin and portion it yourself. Another time, you might choose a different cut and cook it slowly until the connective tissue has had time to soften. The goal isn't to make every meal luxurious. The goal is to know what your money is buying. That is a much more useful skill. And if you are buying for a family, that skill becomes even more valuable. You don't need everyone eating a giant steak. You can buy a larger cut, portion it intelligently, freeze what you don't need immediately, and build meals around it. Just remember to package those portions properly before freezing. Air is the enemy of long-term quality. Wrap the meat well. Remove as much excess air as practical. Label the package with the cut and date, and don't forget what you put in the freezer. There is nothing more frustrating than discovering an unidentified frozen package months later and trying to guess whether you're looking at strip steak or something your future self has already forgotten. Good meat deserves good handling, and that is another part of butcher thinking that doesn't get enough attention. Buying is only the beginning. Storage is part of quality. Preparation is part of quality. Cooking is part of quality. Serving is part of quality. A great steak is the result of all of those decisions working together. So if you remember only one idea from everything we've talked about, remember this. Don't shop for steak by reputation. Shop by evidence. If the label says prime, look at the marbling. If it says ribeye, inspect the cap. If it is a strip, study the muscle shape. If it is filet, look for silverskin. If it is a porterhouse, compare the tenderloin. If it is a whole cut, calculate the price per pound. If it says mechanically tenderized, read the cooking instructions carefully. And if two steaks cost the same, don't assume they will eat the same. That is where the real opportunity is. You are not trying to outsmart the store. You're simply refusing to let the package make every decision for you. There is no conspiracy behind the meat case. There doesn't need to be. A store has thousands of packages to sell. It isn't their job to stand beside you and explain which steak has the best cap or which strip has the cleanest muscle structure. That responsibility is yours. And once you accept that, shopping becomes much easier. You don't need to know everything. You just need to know what matters. The funny thing is that this knowledge tends to change what you buy. You may discover that you don't actually need the most expensive package. You may find a smaller steak with better structure. You may realize that a whole cut makes sense for your household. Or you may simply stop buying steaks that you would have automatically picked 6 months ago. That is progress, because the goal isn't to become the person who spends the most money on beef. It's to become the person who gets the most out of the money they spend. So the next time you're standing in front of that case, slow down. Don't let the crowd behind you rush the decision. Take the packages out one at a time, compare them, look at the meat, look at the shape, look at the marbling, look at the thickness, read the label, then make your choice. And when you get home, don't ruin that work by treating the steak like a frozen dinner. Dry the surface properly, season it appropriately, use enough heat to develop a proper crust. Watch the internal temperature, give it time to settle after cooking, then slice it correctly. Those little decisions are what turn good raw material into a good meal. And if you want to save even more money, start learning whole cuts. That is where the next level begins. Once you understand how a strip loin becomes individual steaks or how a tenderloin is divided into different portions, the meat case stops looking like a wall of mysterious